So, welcome everyone to this session on how to prepare for your exams, either national or European exams. The tips we will give you are applicable to all exams that you might take in gastroenterology. We are with 4 people in the panel here today. I'd like to introduce them. Charlie Murray, who is chair of the UEG Education Committee. He will present shortly on how you can use the UEG library to prepare for your gastroenterology exams. And then afterwards, we have Chuah, who is one of the European board exam survivors of this year. And he will give you some really valuable tips on that. And we're also honored to have Isabel Cremers here, who is the president of the
European Board of Gastroenterology and Hepatology.
European Board of Gastroenterology and Hepatology.
Hi.
It was a really mouthful.
Okay.
Took a second before the mouthful came out.
Okay.
But welcome here, and Isabel is also here to answer any questions you might have on the European board exam. This session was co-organized by the UEG Young Talent Group and the Education Committee. And we welcome everyone. You can ask us questions either by typing in the message board in the public chat room. But after each presentation, we'll also give some room to turn on your microphone and ask the questions in person to one of our panel. So, Charlie, would you like to start with your presentation?
Thank you, Yasmin. I will do. So, floor is over to me. So, welcome everyone that's joined the session today. It's the second time we've done a session like this, actually. Obviously, the first time was in person, was very successful at UEG Week previously. And what I'll do is go through how you can use UEG Education and all our online resources to study for your examinations, and particularly for the board examination, which Isabel can answer questions on about later. And actually, Sean, I know because I've seen it, has done an excellent presentation about the examination itself and how he prepared for it. So you really do have a wealth of knowledge to tap into after this presentation. I think there's a disclosure slide, which I'll go past quickly. So before I get into what we have available for you, it's worth saying that we've really increased our educational offerings over the last years. I was lucky enough to start with UEG Education around 2013, at which stage we were really getting into increasing what we had available online. And I think it's fair to say that over the years that have gone by, we've increased all of that in terms of how we provide it and what we map that information to. And what's become increasingly obvious and what we're really aiming to do is to map all of our educational offerings to the curriculum of the Blue Book from the European Board, so that we can actually make sure that we cover all aspects of gastroenterology, continue to learn, continue to advance and excel, and bring all of you guys up to speed with the knowledge that you acquire to pass exams, and then continue learning throughout your career. So you may have noticed, I'm sure you have, within the last year, that we've revamped the website at UEG, and it's now much more easy to use and a really great usable experience. What you see in front of you here is the education page, and that's really to remind me as well about all the great things that we have to offer. So I'll talk through those individually in a second, but if you look below halfway down the page there, you'll see that in terms of online education, we have our online courses, which to a certain extent are our flagship offerings, which really give you an in-depth delve into certain aspects of gastroenterology and hepatology. We've had huge success this year in terms of people attending with webinars, and we tend to do more of those in the future with a webinar on artificial intelligence in gastroenterology planned for the new year. But I'd really recommend going back and looking through those. They're available on the site, both on our site and on YouTube as well. And the virtual summer school is again something that really came into fruition this year because we had to do everything virtually, and it was a huge success. And for those of you that are not potentially doing the examination soon or would like to think of that, we'll be offering that again next year. And it's really something I'd recommend to all trainees. I'm sure Yasmin and Sean have even more experience of that than I do. We offer face-to-face education, you'll know, and we plan to do a masterclass in pancreatitis in the future. That's had to be delayed because a masterclass is a blended learning concept with some face-to-face parts, which we have inevitably have to put off due to COVID-19. And then the real educational resources I'll talk about today, which are to really help with your examination that you can study for remotely. And there are several things you could do there in addition to the online courses, which include the Mistakes In series, which again is one of our flagship offerings. So in terms of online courses, the number of these has increased over the years, and we're spreading those to ensure that they map to the curriculum to cover a broad range of gastroenterology and hepatology. I'm slightly biased, and I can see the biggest picture we put up here is IBD epidemiology and etiology, which myself and Belle Koch were lucky enough to be involved in. That was published recently. I'd really advise that you get to the website, and if you haven't already, and the fact that you're here means that you get your My UEG account and you use our free educational resources to look at the broad range of offerings that we have available there. When you have done your courses or you're halfway through, one of the new functionalities of the website is that you have a UEG dashboard. It's actually very useful because that allows you to see where you are with courses. We hope you do them all in one go, but if you haven't, you can go back to them. And also in a very easy way allows you to download your UEG completion certificates. And if you want, we do aim to get CME accreditation for all of our courses, which is also available through the website. You can see on the right-hand side there. Now, Mistakes In has been a really successful series, both in terms of presentations at the meetings themselves, and again, we had that recently at the UEG week, but also online in terms of being one of our most successful and most visited parts of the site. Now, for any stage in gastroenterology, whether you're in training, whether you've got your first attending or consultant jobs, depending which European country you're in, these are always useful. These are mistakes made or by experts in their fields, and the full title is Mistakes in a certain subspecialty and how to avoid them. And they really do give very useful but very digestible small information that you can look at very quickly, but learn a huge amount of information. So very useful for studying for exams, because you can really pick up where the gaps in your knowledge are. If you want to use the My Favorites tab, that's another great way of doing it, because within your My UEG page, you can actually put that in. You can mark the things, the aspects of the site that you've enjoyed the most, and that you can then get to much more quickly when you revisit. Now, I've talked about Mistakes In and the online courses, but of course, a lot of the information that frames how we practice in gastroenterology and hepatology is mapped out in both standards and guidelines. And we have a full repository which you can access very easily through the site. And indeed, our standards and guidelines team have done a huge amount of work collating all of those over the last few years. That's actually now gone to another level, which I'm sure you're all aware of, which is that the UEG now has a guidelines app, which you can download from the App Store. And actually that will give you free access to all of the information that we have on the site. Not everything on the site is present on that app yet, but it is slowly increasing and will be continually updated. So an amazing source for you to use throughout the day and during your days at work, and a real bonus for those of us working in European gastroenterology. Now, the UEG page itself, I've talked about what's through the education page, but don't forget that there's a huge amount of information within the library at UEG as well as the things I've talked about. We have the information from previous meetings, we have the information from previous postgraduate courses, and it's very easy, and now with the new platform, much more easy to search for all of that information. And I'd really encourage you to go to the library, have a real play around and see what's available. and see what fits with your learning needs. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on this because I know that Sean and I'm sure Yasmin are much better placed to talk about how they specifically have learned for their board examination, the certificate examination. But certainly within the UK here, we have the MRCP page, which has lots of questions on. I know Sean's going to talk about this, and I'm sure can answer direct questions about how you access them and how useful they are. And I think pretty university in the UK where I work, that this is the tool that a lot of people go to prepare for the examination, and the question bank is the question bank repository within this repository is from those in Isabel's team that have designed this examination. So very well worth you registering with that site and visiting. And this is just an example of how you can learn for the examination. If you look at the questions that you see, it's always useful to go through the questions and find out what the right answer is, but it also prompts you to then look within UEG at what you can do. And of course, here we have something about Helicobacter infection. We have a whole mistakes in section and other parts on the website where you can search for that. And I think we've jumped on here. The slides jumped a bit. If you have a question about pancreatitis, then you can look at the mistakes in section. You can then take a whole online course on that subject. And then you can look at the guidelines, which are all within the UEG website, all easily accessible. Okay, so I think I've covered off most of that. So I think that brings my talk to an end. It's just to summarise, we have everything you need within UEG. We'll be working very hard within the years ahead to map that very specifically to the curriculum. I'm sure Isabel can talk much better to this, but the Blue Book is being revised and will commence, I think, next spring. And as the board do revise the curriculum, we will work at UEG with them to try and map all our offerings to that curriculum, so that you be as you best set as you possibly can to study for your examinations. So Yasmin, I think at that point I'll probably leave things there and hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, for this nice overview. Are there any questions from the audience, the people who joined us? You can either turn on your microphone or type a question in the public chat function. While I was preparing for the exam, I took a lot of online courses, and it's nice because they have videos of 10 minutes, and I used to take the online course while preparing a larger dinner or baking a pie. And then while kneading the dough, I could turn on the video and then do two things at the same time. So that would be one of my first tips. It was good to have a bit of background education to working in the kitchen. Are there any questions?
I think someone's just typing.
Yeah, someone's typing. Yeah, let's wait for that. Did you use the online courses as well, Sean?
Yes, I did use a bit of them. Yeah.
Obviously, when you said a bit, you mean you used them a lot, didn't you, Sean?
Use them for the topics that you get wrong. That's what I would recommend.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yasmin, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I had the same problem. I felt overwhelmed because I think it's a recognizable problem. If you're studying for an exam, you have big plans on how to prepare, and then at the end you always have too little time. So there were a lot of questions. I've mainly focused on the European guidelines, so ESGE, ECHO, and EASL. And I think I did the same as what Sean just said, is that I started with the ones where I got the sample questions wrong, and where I felt that my knowledge gaps were. So in the end, I didn't read all the guidelines that I wanted to read in preparation. There was just not enough time in the busy daily life. So I just focused on the ones where I felt that I had most to learn.
Yeah, no, I'd back that up. I think even within practicing gastroenterology and hepatology, we can't know all of the guidelines. It would be almost impossible. I think that strategy of seeing where your gaps in knowledge are and then focusing on them. I would encourage you as well to use the download and use the app, which actually does distill some of the major headlines that you'll need to know for each of those guidelines, so that you don't get too swamped in the fine detail, which can take a lot of time.
Yeah,
that would be my advice.
Yeah,
Okay.
the app was launched just after we took the exam, I guess. So that's a good tip for next year.
Sorry.
It was okay. Are there any more questions? Someone is still typing, short. Oh.
We're waiting for the next question.
Yeah.
I also suggest our trainees to use the guidelines in their daily practice. After several years of training, you get used to read the guidelines as they come out, and use them in daily practice, so that you don't have to hurry and read 100 guidelines in the last time for your preparation.
That's a good tip.
You can use them. You can easily say to your trainees, present a guideline per week in your journal club once a week. So you go through all the guidelines during the training.
Yeah,
as they come along.
So we have another question from Shad Mohammed, who he asks, he was informed that the exam had a lot of MRCP or ERCP images, and asks how to study for them. While in practice, mostly relying on radiology reports. Sean, do you have a tip for that?
Yes, we will cover this in my presentation. But,
okay,
good answer.
Yeah. So let's start with your presentation then, before we get all the questions that you already cover in your presentation.
Okay, let's
we bring that up.
Yeah.
So I'll just take the presenter view now, and then okay, how do we load the?
You need Julia to put your talk up.
Okay, I'll wait for Julia to.
There it is.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, right. So I'm just going to talk a couple of minutes about a personal view on the exam. So we'll just go through a brief introduction, and I'll give you an idea of when I decided to take the exam, how to prepare for it, what to expect on the day, and some take-home messages. Okay, so I'm Sean. I'm one of the clinical research fellows in IBD. We're doing a study called the MUSIC study in Edinburgh, looking at mitochondrial DNA in IBD patients. I've just completed my ST5 training year, and I'm currently out of program for research. So I come from Johor Bahru, Malaysia, and then I did my secondary and A-level education in Singapore before ending up in university in Edinburgh. And since then, I've spent the last 10 years bouncing around Scotland. So for our European friends, I just thought I'd give you a quick overview of the UK postgraduate medical training structure, just so you have an idea of why I decided to take the exam when I took the exam. So in the UK, when you graduate from university, you do 2 years of foundation training. And back in my days, it's 2 years of core medical training. There's been some changes there. By the end of this stage, you're expected to have acquired your MRCP, and then you go on to gastro training. And during your 5 years of gastro training, you're expected to acquire your ESEGH exam before CCT. So personally, I did my first attempt and at the end of, well, in the middle towards the end of ST5. And the main reason I decided to do that was that it would give me a year of experience in IBD and a year of clinical experience in hepatology and transplant. And that would also give me 2 other chances to take it if we didn't get through the first time. So first thing to tell everybody is how to register for it. If you Google ESEGH, it's the first link that comes up. The most important thing is to look at the registration period and put that down in your calendar. You don't want to miss the registration period, and take a note of the exam date as well. So personally, I thought I was going to prepare for 3 to 6 months before the exam, but obviously with what happened this year, COVID postponed our exam. And when it was rescheduled, we basically had 2 months of notice to get ready for it. So the most important section of the talk is how to prepare for this exam. And the first thing I'll say is that different people have different styles of learning. So you kind of want to have a think about how you learn, how you learn best, and come up with a strategy that fits your style. So I'm just going to go through a couple of things, know what you're facing, go through the different learning strategies, a little bit about language barriers and the psychology of questions, and at the end, a couple of tips about not getting too stressed out about the exam. So the first thing about any exam is you need to know what you're facing. And on the MRCP UK website, they have a breakdown of the questions by topic, which is really useful. So what I would draw your attention to is that IBD and liver take up the biggest percentage of the exam with 40 questions each. So you definitely want to make sure you focus on knowing those really well. And then you will move on, and you do need to have a broad cover of the curriculum, but you kind of want to allocate your time to where you're weak and where the exam is focused on. The one thing I would say here at this point is that, as we know, in IBD, there's been a lot of controversy about how to treat people nowadays. There's lots of new ways of treating and new drugs. And I just wanted to mention that the exam has definitely this year avoided a lot of those types of questions because there's no one right answer at the moment. So a lot of questions that you get will have good consensus behind them. So how do we prepare? I think for myself, I learned the best through experience, and clinical experience certainly is a really important way of picking up a lot of the answers that you need. So going to plenty of outpatient clinics, seeing as many patients as you can in the ward, seeing as many referrals as you can. In multidisciplinary team meetings, you want to speak to your radiology colleagues, you want to speak to your pathology colleagues, have a look at the slides. You know, sometimes with liver biopsies, you get a chance to discuss the actual, look through the microscope with the pathologist. That would be really helpful. And in your IBD meetings and your GI X-ray MDT meetings, you can look at complicated cases it depends on your setup, but certainly in Edinburgh, we have a good setup where we can look at images with our radiology colleagues, and they can give us some tips on understanding what we're looking at. The other thing I tend to do is to discuss cases in our office with our fellow registrars and consultant colleagues and just bounce things back and forth. So if you come across something interesting, you share it with everybody, and they share their interesting cases with you, and that helps you build up the experience that you need to get through the exam. The one tip I would give you is look at the endoscopic and radiological images of all the patients you're involved in as much as you can. So look at their MRCP image, look at the ERCP X-ray images, so that you know exactly what you're dealing with. Because these things there's no easy way around them. You do have to put in the time and the effort to gain the experience to understand the images. In terms of book revision, the MRCP UK website has a great question bank. I would highly recommend you do that before you start your revision. See where your weak areas are, make a note of the topics that you're losing marks in, and then focus your revision on that as a starting point. And a couple of days before the exam, go and take it again and see how you're doing compared to when you started your revision. As Charlie has mentioned earlier, UEG have plenty of resources, and I highly recommend that you use them as an aid to your revision. And as we've seen in the questions, there are a lot of guidelines, in the ECHO, EASL, and BSG guidelines, and it can be overwhelming. And one tip I would give you here is that most guidelines can be distilled down to a single diagram or a single abstract image that they have within the guidelines. Those are the really important bits of the guidelines. For example, your GI bleeding pathways and your anticoagulation guidelines. I would suggest putting that image into a PowerPoint slide presentation that you can just refer back quickly to. So you can just do a quick run through just the day before the exam. Local teaching sessions are great. Depending on your setup, certainly in Edinburgh, we have lots of local teaching and Pan-Scotland teaching that helps cover some of the more advanced topics that you don't see day to day. And what I would say is make a strategy to cover all the topics in a reasonable way. You want to have a broad coverage, but you don't want to waste too much time just doing one topic and neglecting other bits. A couple of words about language barriers. If you're having issues around the language barriers, one of the tips I would give you is watch plenty of videos on YouTube that would help you get around the language barrier, whether it's medical, non-medical, GI, non-GI. It's just getting familiar with the language. And one of the ways you can familiarize yourself with the language is to read the guidelines, get used to the terminology, and practice the questions as mentioned just now. In terms of the psychology of questions, I would say most of it is pitched at clinical application. What do you do with this patient when you see them in clinic? There are a couple of basic science questions which you either know or you don't know. And a couple of imaging questions, which, as I mentioned earlier, you do need to build up the experience. You need to look at the images plenty of times to really get a handle on it. The one thing I would say is that thankfully, there's only a couple of questions on images. So even if you don't have the full ability to interpret the images, that doesn't mean you can't pass the exam. The exam is quite fair and balanced in that, if you're trying to get every point, then you want to apply yourself as much. But even if you miss one or two images, you can still get through. And before we finish up the talk, I just want to say that, don't stress too much about the exam. You have a good chance of passing if you make the preparation. Pass rates are pretty good for a postgraduate exam, above 60%. If you remember, MRCP is about 50% pass rate. And a couple of things to mention. On the day, you will be at a Pearson VUE Test Center. It's 2 3-hour sessions, so you've got to mentally prepare yourself for the long day ahead. There is a very brief 1-hour break for your lunch. So depending on your location, you may not have time to go and get lunch. You probably need to pack some lunch along. You can't leave early, and please remember to bring your ID, because you don't want to waste all your time and not be allowed to take the exam just because you didn't have ID. Okay, finally, take-home messages. I would say plan a strategy, gain as much clinical experience as you can, and find your friends and mentors to help you along. Use all the resources you can, but again, do it in a strategic fashion. Look at where you're weak and focus on that, and you will pass the exam at the end of the day. Okay, thanks very much. I'll pass the time back to the panel here.
Yes, thank you very much, Sean. Those were some really great tips. I'm curious if there's any more questions from the people who joined us in this chat room. Again, you can either use your microphone or type it in the public chat. We have one question coming up there. What question banks would you advise, Sean?
So one of the books I used was this Oxford ski book here. But it is a bit outdated, I'll warn you, because this is back in 2016. So the guidelines have changed quite a lot since then. So you do have to be familiar with which bits are outdated.
The best of 5 book? Or? Yeah,
that's the best of 5 MCQs.
Oh, yeah, okay.
This was the book back in 2016 that everybody used. Online question banks, they are helpful in some ways, but to be honest, the question bank on the MRCP UK website is probably sufficient to guide you as to where you need to focus your time, is what I would say.
Yeah. Yes, I had the same experience. I also used those sample questions for the language barrier that you mentioned earlier. I learned quite a lot of new words from looking at the sample questions, and I remember during the exam I had a few moments from I looked up this word from the sample questions. So I think that's good for also non-native speakers or people who have not been in the UK for a long time. What I would add to your very good tips is, and what you also had in your take-home messages, is that find your friends and colleagues, and that's actually what we did in my center. We were with 5 taking the exam at the same year, and we formed a little club of people who are mandatory to take it this year. And before all the Corona lockdown rules, we actually planned a few nights where each of us would prepare a presentation on a guideline, and we would tell it to each other. And we had a WhatsApp group, so we would regularly send each other updates or send each other some good online video or mistakes in topic. So it is good to have some people to share this with and do it together. Did you do that as well, Sean, or were you alone in this experience?
Yeah, well, there were 3 of us in my year who decided to take the exam at the same time. So we do share our tips and tips and resources and things like that. And one of the things that we did was to go through there's huge numbers of guidelines, the BSG, ECHO, and EASL, and really kind of pull them all into a single PowerPoint file.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
Like you just pull the key tips, the things that you always forget, like how long you stop warfarin before you scope someone and things like that. Just put the key stuff, and then you just flick through it the day before, and that just refreshes your memory.
Yeah, that's a great resource. Yeah.
It does sound like something the UEG need to steal off you, actually, Sean.
Yeah, I think
before you copyright it. It sounds like a great idea. Mistakes in the European exam and how to avoid them. It was born on this phone call. Can I ask a question? Because I didn't have to sit the exam previously. So, do you, just for everyone that's about to take it, did you find that you had enough time, guys? Do you find it was well spaced in terms of time for the exam? Maybe Sean, you could answer that.
Do you mean like the duration of the exam paper?
Yeah, the duration. Yeah.
Yeah, I think 3 hours was definitely on the long side. Most of us sat around for half an hour to an hour after finishing all the questions.
Fine, but you certainly weren't rushed.
No, there's no rush. No rush. There's plenty of time to look at each question properly and just make sure you understand the wording of the question. Don't get tripped up by wording.
Yeah. Well, I usually finish the Dutch exam really quickly, and I felt that I took some more time this one, maybe because it was not in my native language. But I also really took the time to read everything really carefully. So I actually took the whole 3 hours for each 100 questions. I had 10 minutes left to revise the questions that I bookmarked. But that's also because I feel that in the Dutch exam, I usually rush it a bit and then I don't read carefully enough. So this time I really took the time and I did some stretches after every 20 questions. And but then I was surprised that I took the full 3 hours.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just the point, just to advertise what we offer as well. So the UEG courses, as well as being great online educational material, that they actually do have assessment questions within them, many of which are very similar to European board questions. So I'd advise that you do, certainly if you're weak in certain areas, I'd advise you go through those, and you will get good practice and good feedback from the question answers as well.
Can I just comment about
the
language barrier you talked about? We had the very, very preliminary report on this year's UEG, and the countries where the UEG is mandatory and we have the biggest number of candidates are, of course, the Netherlands and Switzerland, and they had a very high pass mark, higher than UK and then European candidates as a whole. So I don't think the language barrier is really such a huge problem. We all study and attend meetings in English. And one of the questions that sometimes we discuss in our meetings is, should we translate as other specialties? And I must say I'm strongly against it. I think if you are a European gastroenterologist, you have to be able to sit the exam in English. And really the pass rate of Switzerland and the Netherlands are more than 80%, which is higher than UK pass rate and the European pass rate as a whole. So I don't think language is a problem.
No, I agree. It's very doable in English. It's just it might take a little bit more time per question. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it really helps to look at the sample questions, because there are you learn about the way of questioning, and
that's an important point. It's not only the science and the clinical practice and everything. It's the way the questions are asked. I mean, they are all we try very hard, and there's a strong regulation about this. They always ask the question in the same way, no negative questions, etc. No 2 or 3 best of 5, 1 best of 5. But also you have to read the question. I mean, you can't rush it and say that for variceal bleeding, the best answer is to perform endoscopy without resuscitation first, or whatever. You really have to read the question, what is asked in this clinical scenario. And sometimes I remember our Dutch delegate saying that the first year the Dutch trainees took the exam, their best trainees weren't always the ones who passed. And when asked about this, they said, well, the right question was so obvious, we thought it couldn't be that answer. So perhaps this particular question was not so well written, because it can't be too obvious, it can't be too easy, but it can't be too difficult. So really, it's science to write questions, and for the UEG, I've learned a lot. But also, I think you have to read the question, read the clinical scenario, read the question, because it's then the answer should be really easier.
Yeah, that's a good tip, because sometimes the clinical scenario is a few lines, and then the question. So it's a good strategy to first read the question, then the scenario, and then the question again.
Yeah.
Because the answer can differ if it's what is the best treatment or what is the first treatment.
Exactly.
Things like that can matter in the right answer. Yeah.
So Isabel, can I just ask a direct question? Because Sean very nicely put up the percentages which are available of the amount of questions which are assigned to certain parts of the syllabus. So I guess 2 questions, just because trainees in my work have asked me these questions. So one is the examination in years ahead, does it plan to have a different spread of questions? As in, will there be not 40% between IBD and liver? Will it be more spread out across the syllabus? Number one. And number 2, are there, and I sort of know the answer to this question, but I'm not sure everyone does, but are there particular parts of the syllabus that appear to be quite weak and poorly answered every year that people can concentrate on?
Yes, well, it's you're quite right, and answering the second question first. We wrote a paper about this, and you can read it. It was published, and you can see where we are stronger as educators, and where we have to work more. And of course, nutrition is the weakest, and I think it's part of our gastroenterology education. We now had our national gastroenterology meeting in Portugal, and there was a strong focus on nutrition and how to educate for nutrition. I think we have to work more on this. And a little also small bowel, small intestinal disorder, a bit linked. So nutrition and small intestine. So these are the weakest parts of the answers. And what was the first?
So the other one was about whether Sean helpfully showed the spread of questions.
Well, as far as I know, next year's UEG should be similar as this last year's blueprints. We haven't changed that. We have a very good bank of questions. And even with the pandemic, we are still very strong, have new questions, also use a lot of anchor questions, so that are already proven as very good discriminators. About 1/3 of questions are anchor questions now. And of course, we have already been through the questions of next year to see if they are at the best, standards of care that we have nowadays. So we had to review all the questions for next year, and it will be about the same blueprint. Perhaps
Great, thank you.
it will change when we review the Blue Book. There are some gray areas, some areas to be filled in the new Blue Book, as you know.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Isabel.
You're welcome.
And just to make the point, and as Isabel's alluded to, but the amount of work that goes into producing these questions is immense, isn't it, Isabel? It's a huge amount of work to get the questions right. So rest assured that the questions have gone through a lot of filtering before you see them in the examination. Yes, over to you, Yasmin. I'm not seeing any questions.
No, I don't see any new questions, but there are some new people who joined the meeting. Feel free to ask questions in the public chat.
I would like to have some of the younger people to join the question writers, but this is such a huge job, because you have to have a lot of training first, and then, of course, writing the questions, discussing the questions in the first meeting, and then again. And after they are in the bank of questions, a few years, they have to be, of course, reviewed. And all the questions for the next diet are reviewed by a panel of experts, both UK and European. So the questions, I feel, are becoming a little bit more European. I mean, we always ask ourselves, is this drug used in UK or in all of Europe? We don't really ask if it's used in Thailand, for instance, but it's an European exam. So the clinical practice, the drugs we use, they have to be approved in all European countries. So we try to have an European view on the answers.
Yeah.
That's great. I think just on that point, Isabel, because Sean raised this as well, and I know you, in the meetings I've been lucky enough to attend with the section and board, this is discussed, but there is the issue, isn't there, of the difficulty in specialities that are very fast moving, in ensuring that none of the questions become out of date very quickly. And I guess more recently, at least, that's very relevant to things like immunotherapy for various cancers and their complications. It's very relevant for hepatitis treatment, particularly hepatitis C, and as Sean said, very, very relevant for inflammatory bowel disease and the various treatments. And I know that you've thought a great deal about that.
Yes.
That's the case, isn't it?
We had to. I mean, all EPC questions had to be treatment, at least. It could never be asked because they were never up to date from one year to the other. All oncology questions have to be carefully weighted, because in some countries, like Belgium, for instance, gastroenterologists do the oncology treatment, oncology care. But that's not the case in all the countries, which perhaps we should work a little bit more on it, because we are so much in the center of the oncology patient problems. But as you say, and IBD, I mean, it's moving so fast that it's like a tide, and I would be in great difficulty to now with therapy. So you're right. We have to stick to questions where there's a ground for consensus. You can't have two right answers, and I mean, people get disoriented, and it's not fair.
And Isabel, I think that's a really important point, isn't it, to get over to everyone that's about to sit the exam, because Sean, I'm sure you'd agree, you could spend hours down rabbit holes, as it were, looking into very, very specific treatment paradigms, which will never be asked about.
Yeah, I think the informal feedback from my colleagues in Scotland is that we all thought the exam was very fair. everything was pretty obvious that, there's no controversial bits in the exam at all. The one thing I would say for UK trainees is to remember to look at pancreatitis, because traditionally in the UK, pancreatitis is managed by the surgeons. So that's just one of the differences that we note that between European practice and British practice.
Well, this year's results, I see the UK trainees did a little less well in pancreatic disorders. So you're quite right. Perhaps you should study a little more pancreas. But on the whole, really, nutrition. But only 10 questions on nutrition. So the results are not so good, but it doesn't weigh so much in the final mark,
I think a tip for people from the rest of Europe, also commenting on what you said earlier, that it's not just UK, it's getting more and more European, the exam. What Dutch trainees noticed that the people in the questions usually tend to drink a lot of alcohol, and I don't know if that's specifically UK, but it was noticeable that 30 units of alcohol per week was a bit standard there. And I think
yes, Lane, everyone has been getting on well until now, and now you've made it,
So
no, but it's a really good. Don't blame the alcohol in each question. That's my tip, because even though the alcohol is quite high, alcohol is not always the right question, the right answer.
Well, having worked in Scotland, I can tell you alcohol is almost always the answer.
Sorry.
Okay, so what's your feeling? In the Netherlands, it's mandatory. In Scotland, of course, it's passed to the training evaluation. And what's your feeling now with people from other countries where it's not mandatory? Do you have some feedback about why sitting the exam? You have some feedback from the young GIs in countries where it's not mandatory. They feel it's a plus for their CV and their career. Tough question.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I'm from the Netherlands. It's mandatory now in our 5th year, and if you don't pass it, you can resit it in your last year. But it's still not mandatory to pass the exam to get your specialty license. But I feel like the feedback we've got from people from other countries is that it's useful to study for, but a lot of people have commented on is that it's quite expensive to do it just as something for your CV. I mean, in the Netherlands, our hospital pays for it, but if you pay for it yourself, then you're really looking for an extra benefit. And I think if you're applying for a job where this is a plus, then you can see that benefit. But I think in other countries, that plus isn't really there yet, but maybe in the future.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of candidates from countries outside Europe, and they surely see that as a plus either in their own countries to have a job, and then sometimes they even the hospitals send us requests to verify the authenticity of the diploma. Okay. And sometimes they feel it's a passport to come into Europe, or I mean, to be accepted to work in Europe. It's a plus. So that's my feedback, the feedback I receive. So they feel that it's the people who sit the exam, that it's useful for their career.
Okay.
Okay, so I see no more answers from Shad Mohammed. But
no, Monica is typing.
Okay.
So we've shown the flyer now for next year, Isabel.
Thank you. It's similar to the last year's flyers. It's the same model, so it's really just so you can print it. Perhaps you can ask someone to insert it in the UEG website to help publicize it. I don't know if it's that possible, or also in your national society. So if possible, I mean, try the young GIs. I always ask young GIs help for publicizing the applications date and the examination date.
That's great.
Yeah,
so
in the
it's
Netherlands, it's already circulated. Yeah.
And it's almost upon us, isn't it?
Yeah, almost. I mean,
we're almost at the end of the wonderful 2020.
Time flies as we are struggling with COVID patients. I have a lot of my trainees and young gastroenterologists from my department. They are now working again, because that was the first wave, and now in the second wave again in COVID wards, and it's taking a toll. Especially the trainees are very unhappy with that, because it's maybe useful for other specialties, but but not for gastroenterology. And coming back to our gastroenterology practice, endoscopy practice, we had a survey. It's being you have also had a paper in UEG journal, and we also did a survey not only during the first months but also after, what happened after. I think the trainees are taking a toll on that.
Yeah. So, well, Monica is maybe typing a last question. Yeah, here. Monica is asking, some trainees in the UK do both the SCE and the ESEGH. Is it worth doing both? And is there any difference? So personally, I don't know what the SCE is. Can you explain that, one of you?
I mean, the ESEGH is the SCE now.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's the same exam. It's just SCE is now being rebranded. Yeah, same exam.
Thanks, Monica.
Yeah. So that's a good clarification. Yeah.
Good.
Okay. So maybe as a wrap up, one last tip from all of us. Sean, do you have a last tip?
Just find friends and colleagues, mentors, everybody to help you, because these things are not done in isolation.
Good one, especially in 2020. Isabel, a last tip?
Well, I would say not to look at it as surviving the exam, but enjoying the exam.
That's a really good one. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Charlie?
My tip is obviously going to be to use all the UEG resources to get you over the line with the examination, but also just in general. And Isabel's point is a good one. All of our content is enjoyable, so do have a look around and use it accordingly. Thanks, Esme.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your input to this session, and also for the questions from the audience. And good luck to everyone who is taking the exam next year, and also to Isabel for organizing it. And we are curiously awaiting the new contact in the UEG Education Library, Charlie. Because that's always good when it has new content, even if you don't take any exams.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation, Yasmin. Thank you very much.
And thank you for coming, Isabel. It's been really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.